So yeah, I've been working on insects in the context of sustainable agriculture since about 2010, so about 15 years. And it's a study system that is never ending. You know, how long is a piece of string? There's many questions that you can ask with insects. They are so important to our terrestrial and aquatic environments, and they have a real impact on us as human beings as well. So like all my research kind of falls into this big umbrella. I really like insects. I really believe in sustainable food production, and it's been a really fun place to kind of focus my research, my research intensity over the last 10 years or so. So yeah, the roadmap for today for what I'm going to be talking about. Let's see if we can change to the next slide. Yeah. There we go. So talk quickly about what the need is for sustainable agriculture. This is something that I'm at the Faculty of Agriculture in Truro, and we're all very much invested in working on this collectively with global partners. I'll talk a little bit about why sustainable agriculture needs insects. They are a critical part of so many solutions. And then kind of flip that on its head and talk about why insects need sustainable ag. These two things go hand in hand. And then I'll kind of delve into some examples from my own work, some of the work that my students and collaborators are doing. And then lastly, we'll open it up for some questions and some conversation. So again, thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure to do in-person things. It's great to see friendly faces.
There are people on Zoom, is that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, lots of people on.
Yes, plus you on Zoom. I'm so sorry.
You have to.
I can see the number. I can't see the faces, but I imagine you all there smiling. So thank you. So the first bit I want to talk about is this need for sustainable agriculture. And this is something that's at a society level, we're all pretty aware that we need to make some pretty significant changes. And there's so much good big picture evidence looking at what our challenges are and some of the solutions to those challenges. I think it's always worth kind of thinking about what this looks like. So some of the examples that we're familiar with, looking at nutrient balances, seeing that there is too much nitrogen where it shouldn't be, there's too much phosphorus where it shouldn't be. This leads to all sorts of environmental complications. And a considerable portion of these things is linked to the use of fertilizers. Fertilizers being applied at the wrong time, fertilizers being applied in an incorrect amount, fertilizers being applied at a point when a bunch of water can wash it into a waterway. A lot of challenges there. We know that there's a lot of land use change that's still happening. We're seeing these very, very diverse habitats like tropical forest, grasslands being modified into very, very simple ecosystems that hold very few species. And then of course we have this looming specter of climate change where so many of our activities that we do to grow food are releasing carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, which then contribute to the destabilization of our global climate systems. These are all major challenges that we have, and agriculture has a significant footprint in causing all of these challenges, often the largest piece of the pie. When we think about healthy diets, we're seeing this global shift change from what's healthy for humans into this broader idea as to what is healthy for humans, but also is necessary for the health of our planet. There was a very influential paper that came out a couple of years ago now called the Eat Lancet Report, which pulled together several dozen leading experts from across the world to kind of come to a consensus as what does a healthy diet look like for humans and what does it look like for the planet. And it's a beautiful, beautiful document with, I'm just gonna hide that so you guys can see, move that to the top. There we go, that should do. So this is just a picture of what this planetary health plate looks like based on the Eat Lancet report. Lots of vegetables, a much smaller portion of whole grains than you might have seen traditionally with the former Canada food guides. Animal protein here is shrunk compared to what we might have seen conventionally. A much bigger emphasis on plant proteins. These are generally thought is the proteins with a much smaller environmental footprint. This is just a kind of a really quick roadmap to see, hey, if we're trying to balance human health, prevent disease, and take care of our ecosystems, what should we be eating? It looks something a little bit like this. When you compare this to different countries across the world, some countries are doing better than others. I just pulled some data from the World in Data, which looks at the Eat Lancet report. This is grams of food per day. This is the recommended bar on the top, and then below is what we have in Canada. So you can see these things don't look exactly the same. There's a difference in size of the bars, so we're generally consuming a little bit more than is recommended for the health of the planet and for the health of humans. And some of these categories are overrepresented in terms of the amounts that we're getting in our diets. So of most significance, we have things like milk. We're seeing almost 40% or almost double the amount of milk and other dairy products in our diets in Canada compared to what this consensus of experts recommends. We're seeing a significant increase in the amount of red meat. That's another one that's often pulled up. And then lastly, sugars and oils. The blue and the purple bar here, we're seeing a lot more of those than what we ought to be consuming for our own health. So we have this idea of what we need to eat. We know that we're getting there, but we still have all this, human behavior and policy to change to get us closer to these targets. So it's a really, really interesting multidisciplinary problem that requires people, working across the whole food system to change and to move in the direction that we're hoping to see, which I think is very, very exciting and interesting as a problem to work on. And then when you think about the agriculture and food sector, there's just so much really amazing work going on to find solutions. Like science is a way that we can build a better world. And there's so much happening in the realm of sustainable agriculture and sustainable food. At Dalhousie in Truro, where I work, there's people working on all kinds of amazing things, working to create very, very high resolution digital maps of soil so we can learn how to take better care of our terrestrial resources. We have people who are working on animal welfare, people working on feeding animals more sustainable foods to reduce their greenhouse gas footprint. There's all kinds of really, really exciting stuff happening, which brings together people from all different fields and interests. It's I'm really proud to work in this system because I think it's a place where there's a lot of room for doing good. And really interesting science underpins it all. So for instance, thinking about animal welfare, this is one thing I'm very interested in learning more about. I'm always reading about it. For instance, if you think about things like chickens, chickens tend to have a smaller environmental footprint than a lot of other animals. We eat a lot of chickens, and the welfare of those chickens is very, very important for thinking about how do we do better globally. You can look at the conditions that these chickens are kept in. We're seeing new legislation coming in that's working to give these chickens that are providing us with really important nutrients, giving them a better life, giving them more space, allowing them to express their natural behaviors. This is all done through the work of scientists, figuring out what are the needs of these chickens, how can we make them policy so that these birds live a happier life. I think it's just very important work. And I pulled a lot of this stuff from our World in Data, which is just a fabulous resource that I am constantly reading whatever new articles they have out. They're very well explained. Their references are excellent, and their graphics are truly beautiful. It's a work of a lot of people that come together and share their knowledge. It's a really an excellent example. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why sustainable agriculture needs insects. And this is probably my favorite thing to talk about ever. We've all heard about bees, and that's sort of like the poster child for why food production needs insects, but it goes so much further beyond that. But I will give a shout out to bees because they are also, of course, very important. I just wanted to shout out Dr. Greg Wanger from Oberlin. I was watching this excellent NSIS talk a few months ago about the work happening here in Halifax at Oberlin, turning black soldier fly or turning waste products into black soldier fly meal, which is then fed to other animals. These insects are truly part of a food of the future. It's amazing what they can do. Students in my entomology classes are always talking about them. There's a ton of excellent research on them. I really hope I can work on them one day because they're very cool. They can take things that are, very low value in terms of the calories or in terms of the protein or fat, and these insects can chomp through it and quickly go from a tiny little egg to this big fat larva that's full of nutrients very, very quickly. And you can do this with a very small amount of space. You can do it in urban environments. It's amazing. It can be scaled up, it can be scaled down. It's very flexible. And we're seeing people across the world turn to this insect to find ways of repurposing waste or undervalued products, which is just super exciting. It's a great talk. If you haven't seen it, I very much recommend it. It's fabulous. Insects have spent millions of years adapting to their environment, evolving over time, and they can do some really cool things. Tech can do it too. Whenever I see an article about pollination and robots, I'm reading it. I don't think you'll ever convince me that a robot can do anything better than a bee, especially not when you start to factor in the cost of some of these things. This is a greenhouse. Some of the robot YouTube, oh my goodness, you can go down a rabbit hole on farm YouTube, but especially farm robot YouTube. It's amazing what people can do. This thing can detect flowers with a robotic eye and basically uses a puff of air to blow the pollen out onto other flowers. So there's been a few different things that have been trialed for like raspberries, blackberries, and tomatoes are the ones that they've tried this out on. But you can also just pop a few bumblebee quads in a space like this and have a similar output, or better yet, work on conserving some of the native ones that can do the same job. So it's very, very cool. But I mean, you can have robots, or you can rely on these little tiny six-legged friends that can do it for you too. I took this video last summer in my neighborhood. It's anyone recognize the bug? I'll play it again for you. This is an aquatic beastie. It's one of our largest ones. It's a American water bug, and they're big. They're, I don't know exactly how big, 3 inches long, 3.5 inches long. They're one of our most conspicuous insects. So not necessarily the heaviest, but they're big. They're one of the few insects that come to mind when I think about Pulitzer Prize winners. Pilgrim at Tinker Creek won the Pulitzer for nonfiction in 74 or 75. It's a beautiful book. It's one I come back to a lot. And one of my favorite quotes from the whole book is, "Fish gotta swim, birds gotta fly, insects, it seems, gotta do one horrible thing after another." And in this, Dillard is referencing this scene she comes across where she sees this frog that's slowly kind of being shriveled up and deflated, I think is the word she uses. And it's one of these things that's coming up underneath it and is basically pierced into its body and is digesting it outside of its body and then sucking it back. So some insects can actually feed on vertebrates. This is one of them. They're really interesting insects. You find them sometimes kind of in May and June when they're flying to new ponds. If you handle them, they will sometimes bite you, and it hurts because they do have a digestive enzyme in their saliva, or that they pump into your skin, and it does. I've stepped on one as a kid, and it hurt a considerable amount. But they're not aggressive insects unless they're in your hand or under your foot.
What's the scientific name of it?
This one is, I believe it's the family's Belostomatidae. I think this is Lethoceros is the genus, but there's a few different ones. Yeah, they're actually consumed in parts of the world too. They're quite big. They also have parental care. The females lay their eggs in some species on the back of the males, and the males assume that risk of having a raft of eggs glued onto their back, and it's substantial, like dozens and dozens of eggs in this really thick mass all over their back, which affects their ability to fly. It's they're amazing insects. They're truly cool, and they're very clumsy flyers. This one I actually had to chase it. I saw it because a starling had it in its mouth, and I chased the starling, and then the insect fell out, and was able to kind of keep the bird away and bring it into the lab to show the students, because it's one you don't see very often, but they're not terribly uncommon. In agricultural systems, insects do a lot of gross stuff like eating frogs, but stuff that's more useful for humans and human interests. Couple little videos here. This is a little shield bug that's basically eating through very much the same mechanism as the last insect was. He's a true bug. He sticks his little proboscis into an insect and just kind of slurps it back. And here we have a paper wasp doing let's use wasp here doing a similar thing, munching down on a caterpillar. So this happens in a big enough area, hundreds, thousands, millions of times. There's been lots of economists who have actually been able to put a value on this in different systems, and it's amazing what these little insects can do when you start scaling up how many of them occur in a system. So these are examples of natural predation events. I know that many people in Halifax have dealt with bees, and I've been getting a ton of calls about Japanese beetles. They eat everything. You can see this fellow here. You can tell the males and females apart based on something to do with their shape of their front legs, and I can't remember which. Anyway, this is a male or a female, and it's feeding on a flower. But what's interesting is you may see this, if you look long enough, there's like a little white dot on the picture on the right-hand side, on the green kind of shouldery part of the bug called the pronotum. That's an egg of a fly that's laid its egg there. And within the day, this egg will have hatched, and a little baby fly, a maggot, will have crawled in between the plates of this insect and gone into the body cavity. And what it causes the insect to do behaviorally is dig itself into the soil. And then within a couple of days, this larva has consumed enough of the internal organs of this insect to kill it. And then it cleans up, eats everything else, and then pupates. So it becomes a little cocoon inside the insect over winter, and then emerges the following year and does this to, I think, between 3 and 4 dozen other Japanese beetles. So this is an example of a parasitoid. And if you're talking about environmental benefits provided by insects that are gross, parasitoids are the place you want to put your time and money, because they do so much cool stuff, and they can reproduce very, very quickly. It's a really remarkable thing to study. And they do all kinds of interesting things with altering their host's behavior from inside the body. And it's very, very cool. There's a lot to learn about these guys as well. And the ones that I work on a lot, this is an excellent video from Australia. It's sped up. What we have is a big wet cow poop, and you can basically see that it's disappearing. And what's happening around it is that a lot of sand is being pushed up. What's happening here is these little beetles are making nests in the soil, and they are kind of jam-packing dung. The adults, the liquid part, they only filter feeds to kind of squeeze like a sponge, they squeeze out the liquid. They're eating that, which is like the dead and living microbial matter. The larvae eat the undigested plant matter and the dead microbes. And basically the activity of dung beetles causes things to decompose much more quickly. There's a recent meta-analysis out last week that says the addition of dung beetles on average improves pasture productivity about 17%. So people ever ask, you ever want to know how much does a dung beetle improve plant growth? It's about 17% is the latest meta-analysis. It's a really nice meta-analysis too. They did a great job. But yeah, eating bugs from the outside in, eating bugs from the inside out, feeding on the excrement of larger animals. They do all kinds of really kind of gross stuff that has huge, huge benefits because it's basically classified as an ecosystem service, things that our ecosystem is doing for us for free, and things that are pretty hard to automate with robots or other forms of technology. They do a lot of really cool things. On the flip side, insects need us, right? As individuals who are all looped into the food system as farmers, you know, however we engage day to day, we have some interaction with the food system. And insects do rely on us to provide things for them too. I've just pulled some photos here. These are just things that I've encountered on my day-to-day life. This is kind of interesting. The first one up here is a cellar spider that's eating an earwig. So that's just something I didn't know they ate. They usually eat other spiders, as far as I'm aware. We have things like these beautiful dragonfly here, 12-spot skimmer. Galls, I've been working a bit on galls with an undergraduate student, Alex Indigo, who's really interested in understanding how insects impact the strength of dyes that you make from plants affected or not affected by gallers. This is a picture of a chimney swift there on the bottom middle, which looks like every picture ever taken of a chimney swift by me. Blurry, funny little bird, but they eat entirely insects. They're wonderful to watch. We have pollinators like bees and swallowtail butterflies, and then the one down the very bottom left is one of my favorite wasps. This is called Pelecinus polyturator. It's a June bug parasitoid. So June bugs are one of my favorite bugs, like the big brown clumsy scarabs you find in May and June. This one is really interesting because it has a very, very, I guess, long latitudinal range. It goes all the way down to South America, all up to kind of our latitude. And it's primarily reproducing asexually. So you rarely see the males. And this female can clone herself and develop in the larvae of June bugs. She feeds on a bunch of different kinds of June bugs, but they're just very cool. They're very funny flyers. They're very slow because they hold that humongous egg layer. So she sniffs out June bugs in the soil and then uses that long ovipositor on the end of her abdomen to like jam it down and find a host and lay an egg. That egg then kills the host and eventually pops up the following year as one of these amazing wasps. So something to look out for. They're truly gorgeous insects that come out in kind of August and September is when you normally see them mostly. And they do all kinds of things. They feed birds, they pollinate plants, they help turn over organic matter. They feed frogs, they feed snakes. They do all kinds of amazing things in our environments. And you know, any day you pick up a new scientific journal, you can learn about something else surprising that an insect is doing. Sometimes it's really funny. So one of my favorite pandemic teaching memories was a student we had join us from BC, and she found this article about how aphids kick their babies. So when aphids sense fear, they emit a chemical smell that causes all of them to fall off the plant, and then they had to crawl back up onto the plant. And the babies try to get onto their mothers' backs so they don't have to walk because it's a very long way, but the mothers kick them off. Anyway, there's this amazing paper all about aphids kicking their babies and how the moms have to, looking at the actual trade-offs of why do they kick it. There's no actual real benefit they do that, but they think it's something else more serious. But anyway, the babies do try to get back on the mom when they fall off the plant. So even things as reviled as aphids have, you know, are worthy of behavioral study. You can do all kinds of interesting with insects, and they do all kinds of amazing things. I really do love working on insects, and for anyone who's curious about insects and wants to learn more about them, there's space for everyone and anyone to work on them. There's more than 1 million to pick from. There's lots we don't know, even about the most, you know, common ones that we've studied for centuries. It's amazing. New things come out all the time. One of the reasons why insects need sustainable ag is we know that insects are in decline. There's a lot of media hype about this. Some of the coverage is very good. Some of it lacks a lot of important scientific nuance. I think the person doing the best work on this is an Australian ecologist, Manu Sanders. She's amazing, just really sharp. and has a background in English and the humanities journalism. So just a really good writer, and has some really good takes on on nuance, and not saying that this isn't a problem, but making sure that the public is not being misinformed by the spins that we're having through media and through people acting in I guess in bad faith or or not providing the correct context. It's about truth and good coverage anyway. She's awesome. So I highly recommend her work. It's amazing. She runs a blog and then publishes a lot on this subject as well. But insects are in decline. Terrestrial ones are in larger decline. Many aquatic insects seem to be bucking the trend and increasing in abundance and biomass. And that's because of general legislation. People are, putting more protection on fresh water. Cleaner water with fewer things in it means healthier insect communities, which means more insects. So they're pretty responsive to environmental change. You do good things, you do things well, and they'll respond. Another reason why insects need sustainable agriculture is that if we look at a systems approach or a landscape approach, and we're seeing more and more land being devoted to grow a handful of crops with very low genetic diversity, and with a lot of inputs of fertilizers and pesticides, this comes at a loss of irreplaceable habitat, right? So we know that land use change is still happening, some of it legally, some of it illegally. But again, we need to be thinking about that, because insects really do, when we expand our food production in certain ways, that can have major implications for rare species and for overall insect diversity. And then lastly, when we think about agriculture, even if we never have any more expansion of agricultural land into more natural environments, if you look at the land on Earth, 71% of that is habitable, and then 46% of that is currently used for food production. And that looks very different. So you think about something like this, where we have very low genetic diversity. This is a maize field, cornfield, right, with probably lots of inputs. You can have something that is much more diverse. This would be like a market garden. You can have things that have integration of trees, like a silver pastoral system. These are all lumped under this big umbrella of agriculture, but the kinds of ways that we choose to grow our food have major implications for insects. You can imagine which of these habitats might have fewer insects than the others, right? It's it matters how we grow our food. It matters what kind of food we choose to grow. These have big implications, especially when you start scaling it up and thinking about just how much of the land that we use is used for producing food. But yeah, I thought what I would do is just kind of share 3 bits of work that I've been working on that tie in, I think, quite nicely to this idea. Some are led by students, one's led by me when I was a postdoc. But again, this is a really fun place to work. If there are any folks out there today who are thinking about things to study in their future, insects in agriculture, great place to go. You'll never run out of work. You'll never run out of questions, and you'll never run out of funding. It's a dream come true for a scientist. There's lots of demand for the kind of work that people working in this space are doing. So one thing I thought I'd talk about, this is my favorite dung beetle to work on. I've worked on this one a lot. So I'm introduced to it during my PhD. On the left, you can see it as an adult. On the right, you can see their baby photo when they're super cute. This little guy is called Anthophagus nutricornis, and it is a like when you think about a dung beetle, people often think about like the rolling dung beetles. The ones that I work on don't roll. They're nest builders, but they just go directly below a dung source. So if you're ever out in a farmer's field and you see a cow pat and there's all kinds of like soil that's been excavated up on top of it, that's the work of one of these guys. They're amazing. They weigh about, oh, I don't even know, I'm not gonna get that correct, so it doesn't really matter what their actual weight is, but they, an estimate is that it's about 500 to 600 times their own weight they can bury in dung in a couple of days when they're building their nests. The males have this handy dandy little feature. Whenever you work on an organism, it's great if you can tell apart the males and the females, and this one is a male. He's got a little horn on his head. So males have those, they use them to fight off for females, to fight other males for female access. And then this is the baby, and we've actually taken this baby out of the soil to measure its nest and disturbed him rudely. We put him back in though, and he did eventually emerge to an adult, which is nice. But yeah, we're looking to see how some different pesticides affect how these guys work. And really the reason I was so interested in it, this is a little graphic I did a couple years ago for an explainer article. And this is my guy down here building these nests. And some of them are even lazier than the tunnelers. They actually just hang out in the dung pat, what are called dwellers. So not all dung beetles are rollers. Some of them are even kleptoparasites. They dig down into the nests and then eat the babies of other dung beetles. Some of them feed on dead millipedes. Some of them feed on funguses. Like they do all kinds of cool things. They're not all true dung all the time. They do some different kinds of things. But they're a great system to work on. I love these guys. They're very, very important. One of the reasons why I absolutely love them is when they are helping bury dung, help it decompose more rapidly. They support lots of environmental benefits. So they allow pasture to grow, right? I said it earlier, but 17% increase in plant growth when you have beetles compared to no beetles, which is great. They help make those nutrients available. They bring right down into the soil where the plants can access them. So it turns kind of like a necrotic dead patch on the soil into a nice lush green area, which is super. I've been working a bit on this now, measuring greenhouse gas emissions with some students, Katie Stokes and Samantha Bennett, who was a former student here, working with some of the lovely people in the audience today. When they tunnel through dung pats, they actually introduce oxygen, which then kills off the microbes that emit methane from dung. So dung itself is not as big of a source of methane as actual cows burping and farting, which people are generally pretty aware of. But it does, part of it continues to emerge from dung on pasture. So they can actually knock back the methane. We got some really cool work happening. Sam's project is looking at when you feed cows seaweed to knock back their methanogens in their gut, how does that affect the insects that use that dung as a resource, and how does that affect which dung they choose? Do they go for the stuff that's been fed the seaweed, or do they tend to avoid it? Insects can be choosy even if they're generalists. So some really cool work happening led by Sam. And then lastly, they're also really important for soil compaction. And soil is so critical for all of our ecosystems. These guys are kind of like earthworms. They build wonderful tunnels. Dung beetles can go as deep as 3 meters in very, very sandy soils. So when there's a lot of soil there, so they can do a lot of really cool things. I just love them, and farmers love them too. And it's really remarkable to go out with farmers and show them, hey, look, here is your pasture. Let's go look at some of the things that live in the soil, because you just don't see them unless you're looking, once you set traps, unless you do some special techniques to see them. So people are always really excited to hear that their farms are full of dung beetles. It's a nice thing to show somebody. It's not hard to make an argument for why you should care about them and why they're worth being interested in. So in this particular research paper, I was super excited about it. So whenever I was out looking at these beetles, I'd be like, oh man, this beetle is so variable in size. So basically the smallest guys are like about 2 times smaller than the big guys, same species. So that'd be like me walking into this room, and then a few minutes later, you know, a 13-foot person walking into this room would be like, oh, hello, you know, like males, just crazy variable in size, same with females. And looking through the literature, you can find all kinds of things about beetles or dung beetles in community ecology, looking at their traits. And like one of the things that comes up again and again is that larger species are much more important for the health of an ecosystem, for things like how much dung they can bury. Big ones way more effective than small ones. I was really curious, okay, how does this relate with this species from an intraspecific perspective? If we take a big population, pick the biggest guys, pick the littlest guys, measure what they do, are those little guys going to be way less effective than the big guys? And the other part we were curious about is looking at how they're exposed to pesticides, and I'll get into that in a second. But there is a compound that is given, a bunch of compounds that are given to livestock to kill intestinal parasites, which actually affects the insects that use their dung. So we were kind of doing a look into this. First thing we were able to find out here is that basically the big guys, they bury a lot more dung than the little guys, about twice as much, a little more than twice as much. So it scales with size. The bigger you are, the more dung you bury. And it wasn't related to how many brood balls, like the little actual nest they make roughly the same amount. But it is more about the size of the individual brood balls. Nope, that's not true. Sorry, I got that backwards. It comes down to, no, apologies, it's both, but one is more important. I think it was the mean size of brood balls is more important than the number of brood balls. I'm missing one of my plots here. My apologies. Yeah, so the big guys were much more effective than the little guys. And what's great too with these guys is you can do it easily in the lab. You get some containers, fill it with sand, add your cow poop, and then chuck in some beetles, and then within 5 or 6 weeks you can go in and measure everything and get your results nice and quickly. They are very, very easy to keep in lab and in the field. I've been working on this idea of anthelmintics, so things that you give to animals to kill their parasites. This is very important from a welfare perspective. Parasites cause huge losses and are a real problem for many livestock farmers. But what I've been really interested in is some of these things can pass through the animal. They aren't metabolized at all by the animal or very minimally. And the same mode of action that kills the parasite inside the gut of the animal kills the insects that feed on it. And in some cases, it can be for a period of days, weeks. For some of the ones that are like longer lasting action, it can make the dung toxic to insects for months on end. So I was wondering, do the big guys, maybe they're a little bit stronger, a little bit feistier? The main thing that causes an insect to be big in this species is access to nutrition as a larva. So, okay, maybe the larval environment is really stable, they have lots to eat, and they're better able to withstand later stress. And what we found with that was really interesting, was that there wasn't a real difference in mortality between the big and the small beetles. But what we found in this case, this is like, we didn't have the first round they went through, basically no beetles died, everyone did great. We put the same beetles through a different experiment, and at that point they weren't doing so hot. So I'm not sure what exactly it was, whether they were reaching the end of their lifespan, whether they were maybe a bit heat stressed. But what we found is that a small amount of ivermectin, which is the compound we were looking at, basically boosted their mortality. So like, or reduced their mortality, improved their longevity, but also meant that they buried more brood balls. So they were still reproducing when they got exposed to a little bit of a compound. These are tiny amounts. And this is something that's been shown a lot in many different fields. It's a phenomenon called hormesis. My postdoctoral advisor, Chris Kotler, who's at Dal as well, he's done a lot of work on this and shown it across many different kinds of insects, bees, stink bugs, aphids. You see it everywhere across dozens and dozens of species. But no one had actually seen this in dung beetles before. And then, I mean, we looked back in the literature and we saw people had seen it, but never recognized it as being that or never put the name to it. But it does seem like a small amount of these compounds can actually have a positive implication. At least when you look at this one endpoint, there may be other trade-offs elsewhere where it doesn't actually cause a net positive, but it's a really interesting thing to study and something we're hoping to follow up with some more work in the future. It's been really interesting. So learned 2 things. We learned that intraspecific variation in body size is really important in predicting how well these guys provide ecosystem services. And then also these could be a really, really cool model system to look at hormesis in insects. And I think that's a really interesting and worthy line of research to pursue. Other one I thought I would talk about tonight is some work led by Hugo Medeiros, and you guys probably know Karen Harper, who's here as well. Karen was part of this as well. This is a really fun project that happened shortly before COVID. Hugo came over and met with a few of us and said, "Do you want to work on this project together?" We said, "Cool, for sure." Looking at these little leaf mines that affect coffee plants. So a leaf mine is basically an insect that feeds between the layers of a leaf. They cause loss of photosynthetic area. They cause little splotches. Sometimes they can be long serpentine mines, but they're a real challenge for farmers to manage in certain food production systems. So this is in sun coffee, and Hugo did a lot of really amazing work on this system. So in this area in Brazil where Hugo was working, there was a lot of wasps that live in these systems. And wasps are carnivores. They eat lots of things, but mostly caterpillars. And Hugo and his colleagues in Brazil basically recorded or captured these guys in specialized traps, and then went through and identified them all to species level and had it for a number of sites over a bunch of years, and then also measured basically how much these little caterpillars or these little larvae that they're making the leaf mines in coffee were being affected by these control agents. Because when a wasp bites through the leaf to get the bug inside, it leaves a little scar, so you can tell, hey, this one made it to adulthood, this one didn't make it because it was killed by something else. So some really cool things here. When there's on the x-axis here, we have percentage of the forest or percentage of the surrounding area that's covered by forest. And then on the y-axis here, we have abundance in green and richness, or how many different kinds of wasps in the yellow. And basically for both these things, the more forest you have, the more abundant wasps are, and also the more species you have of these wasps. So forest cover is really, really important for the kinds of wasps that you find in these fields. So these wasps are basically flying in from all over the place in the wider landscape. Other thing that's really cool is when you look at actual biological control. So that on the y-axis is like the proportion of leaf mines that have been attacked and eaten by a wasp. And again, on the x-axis in the first one, we have the percentage of forest in the surrounding 500 meters. And basically, the more forest you have, the more of these little leaf mines are eaten up. So more forest, more free insect control. And then when they looked at the relationships between abundance and diversity, like do more species account for more things, really, it was a few species that accounted for the majority. And it's really the abundance of a few common species that really drive predation rather than having a really diverse group. So a really interesting theme there is that like the abundance of insects matters. And we know that when we look at insect declines and trends, we're concerned about loss of species, but also like a big reduction in a species that was once common, which is now hard to find. That can have major implications for the health of an ecosystem. So what did we learn here? We learned that in this case, the models that Hugo was able to run showed that the factors that related to the management of the entire broader landscape meant a lot more than what the individual farmer was doing there, whether he or she was spraying insecticides, whether he or she was applying fertilizers, et cetera. It really, the thing that came out again and again was the wider influence of the landscape. This is the case when you have an insect that's very, very mobile. You can have a really cool thing coming out with that relationship. And then if you think about insect abundance, is that often the abundance of a really common species may be more important to the control service or the ecosystem service than the diversity of species that you have. And this isn't always the case, but in this case it was. So I thought that was a really cool lesson that came out. And it's come out, I mean, you see this again and again in peer-reviewed studies, is that often the strength of a benefit comes down to how many insects are actually there doing it. And often it's like a handful of species that are very abundant, very active, that are accounting for most of the effort. The last one I wanted to talk about was led by an undergraduate student named Jill, and Jill's really wonderful. She just graduated with her master's, and she's doing some really interesting work in the bee sector now with the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. But she was working on this interesting little parasite called Nosema. It was a fungus. Now I think it's a protozoan. It got reclassified. I don't even think it's called Nosema anymore. But it's an interesting one. And the question that she was working on as part of her summer job was a lot of beekeepers take their bees, honeybees, and they send them out for pollination services to blueberry farmers. In some places in the world, when you do that, your bees come back, and they've traveled thousands and thousands and thousands of kilometers, and they come back and they're really not so good. They're stressed out, they've got diseases, they're not doing super high. So what Jill was asking with this honors thesis was, hey, if these bees go pretty close and a couple of kilometers down the road, they go into the blueberry field where there's maybe not a whole lot for them to eat beside blueberry, which is pretty low nutrition, and they come back, does that make them sick? So that's what we were working on. This happened in 2020, so we had a big pivot on design and relied a lot on the generosity of beekeepers to help follow some pretty complicated protocols to sample these hives again and again, and they were amazing to work with, and Jill did such a good job figuring this all out during a really challenging time. I was really proud of her for that. So this is what basically Nosema looks like. You have basically it gives bees dysentery, bloody diarrhea. They dehydrate, the colonies don't do super well, and you can even lose a colony if you get a really high infestation rate of this disease. So yeah, as I mentioned, sometimes this is a blueberry field. They're pollinated by wild insects and by managed insects like honeybees. And sometimes when you send your bees out for these bigger trips, they come home sick. So there can be all kinds of stressors that they are associated with in the field. It could be the movement themselves. It could be application of pesticides in the field. It could just be a nutritional stress, but it can make them sick. So we had 12 bee yards across maritime Canada, PEI, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. 8 of them sent them out for pollination, and 4 of them left them in place for the summer. And these beekeepers went in and sampled bees for Jill and the rest of the team on a monthly basis. And they were able to bring them back, basically do a little bit of lab stuff, crush up a small number of bees, and you can count these spores that are that float up basically out of the bee mush. And you can tell how infested the colonies are. So what we found, which is really interesting, is that there was this cool interaction going on. So if you look at the blue line, this is the bees that stayed in place, and it goes from April to September. So what we saw with the ones that stayed at home is that the number of Nosema spores in their gut just declined over time. And you see a seasonal trend in Nosema because when bees start flying, making lots of flights in and out of the hive, they're not pooping in the hive anymore, they're pooping outside, and the disease load slowly kind of declines. That's a peak in the spring, and then a peak again in the fall, and they spend more time in the hives. But what we saw is that initially the ones that were home started out higher and they declined, but the ones that were being sent to blueberry fields went up. But when we looked more at the data for this is in millions of spores per bee, we saw that the blueberry ones spiked before they actually got moved into the field. So then we were like, oh, that's really unusual. Okay, time to look into that some more. And what it turned out to be is linked to what people are feeding bees to build the colonies up. So standard practice is when you have a bee hive and you're getting ready for the summer, you want that bee hive to be really strong, so you feed them with pollen patties. Pollen patties can be made with all kinds of different things. But they're rich in protein. They can eat with things like eggs or actual collected pollen from other honeybees or blood meal. Really depends on what your insect is or what your beekeeper is doing. But yeah, then we looked through the literature and found that often when you give bees these high protein supplements, that bumps up the amount of nosema in their gut. And the other thing we did with this was we were able to send these bees away to a diagnostic laboratory in Alberta, and they were able to sequence the different little spores they found in there, and we're looking at a few different which ones they were. So there's Nosema ceranae, which is the western honeybee. Nosema apis is the one that is associated with the western honeybee, the European honeybee. Nosema ceranae is the one that's associated with the Asian honeybee. And at some point, no one really knows when, somewhere between when beekeeping became a huge global industry and before we had molecular detection of these spores, Nosema apis got replaced by Nosema ceranae. So normally where you had this parasite that was native to the European honeybee, all of a sudden it was bumped out by this Asian species, Nosema ceranae. And when we looked here, basically all of our sites were Nosema ceranae. So one thing we didn't know, but it happened here too. And no one's really sure why or what, but the protocols need to be changed for this too, because the Nosema ceranae, the Asian one, seems to be less of a problem. Like a bee can handle higher levels of that. The time where you treat bees for the Western honeybee one is much earlier than the Asian one. So it's an interesting thing for producers to know, hey, you're basing your management decisions on a different species than we actually have. So that was a really cool thing we found through this collaborative effort across all these different sites in Maritime Canada. So we learned a few things. We learned that supplemental feeding appears to increase Nosema infestations in the Western honeybee. We found that sending bees out to blueberry doesn't seem to increase the intensity of their Nosema infections. And we learned that here, Nosema apis has been largely replaced in Maritime Canada by Nosema ceranae. So if you're a molecular microscopy person, this is kind of how you would differentiate them. These things are tiny. they're absolutely tiny. So barcoding is a much more straightforward way than taking these high resolution images. So that's kind of the last thing I wanted to touch on today. This is my take home message is that sustainable agriculture does need insects. If we're going to move forward sustainably, we need to take advantage of things that insects can offer our systems and design and manage our systems in a way that we can really benefit from what insects can offer. And then secondly, insects need sustainable ag. You know, about half of our land is being used for producing food. And the fate of insect diversity and also wider biodiversity really is tightly linked to how we farm, what we choose to eat. And yeah, I think that's a really worthy thing to keep studying to find solutions. Anyway, thanks for listening. I just talked a whole bunch. I hope we can have a little conversation. Appreciate it. Yeah.